coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
The grand conceit of it all, and then I will stop because I could go on about this forever. It's just so delicious and hilarious to me. But the grand conceit is that, like, the deep introspective moral problem of Kirsten Dunst's character and all of these valiant reporters who, by the way, all for some reason work for Reuters and the New York Times, as if those are the people that are really getting the cutting edge journalism today and putting themselves in harm's way. But like their biggest internal struggle is like, how can we be neutral at a time like this? But it's like, you're not neutral. You haven't been neutral for like a decade, and this movie isn't neutral. So the whole thing is this elaborate kind of self-flattering conceit on Garland's part and on the part of, I'm sure, the people he's playing to, which is the press. I just think it's like, you know, it's almost, I wish I would have enjoyed more a serious and careful far left description of,
right,
you know, the evils of Trumpist America. Like that would have been more interesting than this movie, but alas.
Welcome, everyone, once again to the Roundtable, the American Minds Editors and Publishers podcast. I'm your host for 2 weeks running. This is a new normal. Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute, publisher of the American Mind and the Claremont Review books. I'm joined by Spencer Clavin, editor at large of the American Mind, formerly features editor, although still heavily involved in all great things at the American Mind, and associate editor of the Claremont Review books. Seth Barron, managing editor of the American Mind. And we have a guest this week. James is out, but we have a guest. Many of you know him, Senior Fellow of the Claremont Institute, Jeremy Carl, who has a new book out, which we wanted to open this episode to discuss a little bit. The book is called The Unprotected Class, How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart. Jeremy's been on the start of a book tour, been in a few states already, done some media. So, Jeremy, we thought maybe you could just give us the sketch of the argument, and maybe we'll ask you some provoking questions, and we can get after it.
Sure. So it's a book, and thanks for having me on, of course. But I mean, it's a book that kind of looks at the rise of anti-white racism and anti-white discrimination in the United States. I sort of I went back and forth about what word I wanted to use because there are some elements that are racist that are not discriminatory per se, and there are other elements that are kind of discriminatory that are not per se necessarily motivated by racism. But we went with racism ultimately. But what it's essentially looking at is I kind of break down through 11 different fields. I mean, everything from kind of how we look at crime to our education system to immigration policy, obviously much in the news, to our military, to healthcare. And I kind of document the rise of anti-white racism and discrimination in each of these fields. And, you know, some of this has been done maybe not quite as overtly because people like to euphemize and use terms like wokeness and things, because I think the very usage of white, that term, is a provocation in the current environment. But, you know, I want to be very direct, but I think beyond just kind of being direct and using that term, I think other people have kind of, they've written books maybe about things that I treat in a chapter. But what I was really trying to do is, you know, I kind of saw those people as they're each touching a part of the elephant, the proverbial blind man. And when I wanted to come in and say, hey, look, the elephant is an elephant. These things are all interrelated. It's all sort of going in the same direction. And then I kind of have some more speculative, but I think well-grounded speculation on kind of why this is going on. In fact, I was on Charlie Kirk's broadcast and podcast yesterday, and I sort of ventured that with the appropriate caveats, and he's like, "Oh no, absolutely, that's exactly what's happening." No, I mean, he was sort of hardcore about it than me, so that maybe makes me think that I'm not totally off base there. And then I kind of end with, just because nobody just wants a litany of woes, to kind of look at what we might be able to do to address this going forward, to kind of get back to a sort of constitutional governance and structure that we're treating people equally regardless of race.
Jeremy, by the sheer providence of the timeline, I didn't know you were coming on the show today, but I happened on Twitter X on this dispute that actually I would really love to get your take on, especially given the summary that you've just given of your book. It was between, I think, Auron McIntyre of The Blaze and Joel, whose last name I frequently forget, of Babylon
Berry,
Bee.
probably, right?
From the Babylon Bee.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So they were discussing whether or not anti-whiteness is itself a cover or a stand-in for anti-Christianity. And I'm interested in your opinion about that specifically, but also more generally, it occurs to me that whiteness, like blackness, is kind of an invented category. It's real because of its inventedness. Like, we definitely now use it and it operates in American life, but it's not actually a race. It's, there are no black races just like that. And so my question, I guess, for you more generally is whiteness a stand-in for other things, or are other things a stand-in for whiteness, or both?
My mealy-mouthed answer, which is only defensible because I think it's actually true, is that it depends on the situation, I think, really. So actually, one of the kind of interesting things that I did not expect in the pre-release publicity that I've done on the book, which is really just beginning to ramp out. I mean, I just I did the tape with Charlie, and then I have an interview with Tucker Carlson coming up at some point in the next week. I would expect that'll drop because I've already taped it. But in kind of looking at that, one of the things that's actually surprised me the most is that the biggest champions I've had have kind of been Christian nationalists. They've really been pushing the book, and I did not expect that. I do have a chapter on the church. I do talk about that. I think some of them liked my contribution to the Christian nationalism debate in the American mind. So thanks for that, Spencer, because I think you'd approached me about that, basically saying, hey, let's get an idiot on there who doesn't actually, know this as deeply as some of the, but as a layperson, just to kind of give a thing. So I do think at times, in a very specific way, this can stand in for Christianity. At the same time, I think whiteness is whiteness, and I think it's usually the driving factor in and of itself. But sometimes people are attacking it as a stand-in for Westernness, for Christianity, for they hate success. Because I'm not a big fan of the term cultural Marxism. I'm not a big James Lindsay-ish, type guy in terms of, I think that there is some interest to his, some of the intellectual antecedents that he comes up with, but I don't think that like people are hitting white people because they're reading Foucault or whatever else, and they kind of have a hot take as a result of that. So I think usually a cigar is just a cigar, but sometimes it's something else. So that's kind of how I'd answer that.
Yeah, it seems like when people are complaining about Christianity, to me, it's like, okay, for instance, people are always saying we need to start taxing the churches, but because especially if they do anything political, but you get the feeling that they're not talking about like the black church.
Yeah, it's not like the Lion of Judah down the street from me, right?
Right.
It's like Presbyterian. Yeah.
Right. And I think if you're talking about the white church per se, I don't really like that term because evangelical churches in particular tend to be much more diverse than mainline churches. But to the extent that the white evangelical is a stand-in for something, I think that is a reason it is a hate object.
Right. So, Jeremy, I wanted to ask you, like, people who defend the concept of anti-black racism or just, racism generally,
right?
They'll say, it's systemic, it's baked in, and we can see it all around us in terms of like social outcome measures.
Right.
Black people, this and that. Okay, they have worse health outcomes, worse career outcomes, prison, et cetera, et cetera. If you want to talk about the existence of anti-white racism, what do you point to as like evidence?
Sure. And there's tons of it. And really the entire book is just marshaling evidence in a just the facts, ma'am type way. And in fact, to a fault, I tried not to write a particularly flowery book, even at the outset. And I think the best thing that my editors did on the book was even the little bits of floweriness or kind of heated rhetoric I had, we just took it out. So I think it's a res ipsa loquitur. The thing in itself speaks. I've got almost 1,000 references to kind of very specific things. But I mean, again, I think you're not always going to see, well, white people are doing worse on this or that outcome, and that explains it. I mean, in the same reason that at a trivial level, right? Like, 33% of American billionaires are Jewish, but that doesn't mean anti-Semitism doesn't exist, right? Like, there's all sorts of complicated reasons that groups might achieve or do well in some variant, of American life, and it doesn't mean that they're not being held back in some way. So, I think you can just point to really clearly everything from affirmative action and a lot of stuff America First Legal and other folks have been pushing on, to employment discrimination, to the way in which the media kind of treats a guy like Daniel Penny, or even the law treats Daniel Penny, who's the New York subway guy who saved people from this kind of lunatic, or a Kyle Rittenhouse, the kind of way that is covered in the media, or he's treated by the press or by the police. And so, I just think there's a huge accumulation of this, or in healthcare, again, regardless of how we might feel about COVID vaccines, there was a racial hierarchy in terms of who got them in many states, including my own, right? So, I mean, this is not like me doing some advanced, really complex Kendi-esque racial theory that I had to come up with this. It's just like, oh, I'm looking at stuff right in front of me and documenting it and writing it down.
And then the trend, right? I mean, the trends on a lot of these outcomes or measures it's not trending up for particularly white men, like,
Sure.
Life expectancy, overdose deaths, income,
Yeah, absolutely. And I do talk about Angus Deaton and his wife, Anne Case, at Princeton, kind of in deaths of despair, and kind of and I think kind of particularly white men, things are really sinking, not for every one of them, but for particularly sort of the working to middle class. You're really seeing lower kind of things trending in a bad direction. And I think we're also kind of getting at a demographic tipping point where it's just difficult to ignore, right? When whites are 85% of the population and somebody's got a little bit of a thumb on the scale against them, it's not such a big deal. When whites are less than 50% of the under 18 population, and that's looking at, say, all 5 of my kids and many, your guys' kids as well, it kind of matters more whether they're not being treated in an equal manner to the way other people are being treated. It's no longer just kind of we'll give a few places to some other group or guys, and it's not such a big deal.
It occurs to me on that score to lure you into yet another intra-right dispute. I promise I didn't set out at the beginning of this podcast just to embroil you in various skirmishes, but there was another interesting exchange between Chris Rufo and Curtis Yarvin in, I guess, I Am 1776.
Yeah.
Which lamentably had lamentably few points of real substantive interest to me, at least. But one of them was when Yarvin said, oh, what do you want to do? Do you want to outlaw discrimination against white people? We have a law that does that. It's called the Civil Rights Act. And so the actual sort of concrete measures that Americans, maybe conservatives especially, are kind of inclined to take in the face of evidence like you're marshaling is, well, let's get Congress on it. Let's do a constitutional amendment. But many of the things that you're dealing with are either cultural, like the media bias, or they're sort of extra constitutional. That is, they contradict what the letter of the law says. And so in that framing, in that context, I'd love to hear about some of the solutions or what we can do about it, part of this argument.
Sure. And I'm friends with both Chris and Curtis. I actually did my own tweet that got a little traction that put me on Team Rufo in this particular dispute more broadly. But I would say, actually, despite more broadly being on Team Rufo, I think Curtis here has a point, and I think Curtis's strength as a thinker is actually kind of interrogating the dynamics of power. And I think he does that effectively with this point, which is to say, an ungenerous leftist critic of my book is going to come out and say, you've called it the unprotected class, but in fact, in civil rights law, whites are a protected class, as is any other race. And what I actually say in the book and document quite clearly is, but in reality, that's not true. And in fact, I think, as much as I love and kind of generously borrowed with attribution from our colleague Christopher Caldwell's excellent book on the subject of civil rights, and then other people like Richard Hanania who've written about this recently. I think a way in which I do differ from them a little bit, and I mean, I don't want to totally impute this position to them, is that I think that there's a lot more going on than just civil rights law, and that if we repealed every civil rights law, and this is maybe me being a little more Yarvin-esque, a lot of these issues would not go away. That a lot of this is baked into the cake. It's cultural. It's also about power dynamics in society that are continually changing. And part of what it is now that you've got this affirmative action ruling, people are picking up the proverbial $20 bills that were just lying on the ground, where people are saying, hey, has anybody noticed that you're like blatantly illegally discriminating against white people in this job application in plain sight, and that's illegal? So now we're beginning to get some people suing on them, which means, these are encouraging. It means that maybe these power dynamics are not permanent. But I do think that Curtis is right to kind of bring up this critique of it's not just the laws, bro, because we've got laws and we're often not following them. And there's a reason we're not really following them.
I just want to get a sense of where you think things are going over the next 30 years. Like, I guess there's a big question, like when America becomes majority non-white,
right?
Well, at that point, does it just become purely pluralistic and we've got all these different groups? Or will like this idea of a non-white consensus kind of merge together and it'll be like, oh yeah, whites, now we're really in an apartheid state because whites are running everything. Like, where do you think things are going?
I'm not a kind of South African level catastrophist about the future of America for a variety of reasons. I think the most catastrophist I'd be is kind of a Brazil type situation, which is not ideal, but it's not South Africa either, right? I mean, we don't need to get into all the reasons why, but I just don't think that we're likely to be kind of headed to that. The other thing, and this is something I do mention in my solutions, it's sort of a little bit more, it's a combination of a formal and an informal solution. There's a race and ethnicity scholar named Eric Kaufman. Some of you guys might be familiar with his work. He wrote a really good book called White Shift that I cite several times in this book. And to kind of compress a discussion of it, he have effectively, I mean, and Kaufman is himself multiracial, but he basically calls for multiracial whiteness, which is, a term of art on the left often. But it's kind of this notion that if you kind of understand the history of the Hispanic category in the United States, it's a very recent category. It is a function of law that we've made. We could choose to make different laws and choose to change incentive structures such that Hispanics, or at least a large number of Hispanics, would choose to identify with the white majority, historic majority. You've already got 1/3 intermarriage. You've already got some incentives for them to do that. If you did nothing but that, all of a sudden, a kind of ethnogenesis, as scholars would call it, gives you a sort of new, more durable majority. And it's not, of course, just Hispanics. You could do this with Eurasians, or, you kind of name your multiracial group, or even other people who just are going to choose to identify with that culture. And then again, I think part to kind of bring that back to Claremont, part of that is in teaching about the Constitution, teaching about our history, having that be in schools, having that something that everybody can feel proud of and have as part of their inheritance. So I think that there are some things we can do to get to that best case scenario. And it involves both affirmative action, and it involves messing around with census categories in the way that the left really does very well. And we're often very flat-footed. But in no way am I kind of writing this book as a, oh my gosh, we are doomed type thing. There's no way we're going to get out of this, bro. It's over. It's never been so over. Not at all. And what's more, I'd also say, I'm not kind of, while I wrote this for people of every race to read, and in fact have a number of reviewers from very different racial backgrounds who've endorsed it, but I'm kind of trying to kick white people in the butt and get them to stop being so pathetic, because a lot of this is like white people being too cowardly to stand up for themselves. If they would just do that and say, hey, you know what, like, I'm not going to allow myself to be treated as less than legally or otherwise, I think a lot of this goes away, and it doesn't go away before we do that.
Yeah, and I just wanted to state as a backdrop, Jeremy, and see what you think of it. I mean, part of the reason that we're talking this way these days is that one of the unfortunate spillover effects of our modern sort of obsession with identity politics and the law, which has its roots, as we've alluded to, in the 64 Civil Rights Act, and I should say especially its administrative and jurisprudential children or progeny. The reason we're talking so demographically and almost talking the implicit assumption in what you just responded to, Seth, about is that somehow American civic nationalism that's rooted in the Constitution and the principles of the Declaration, Claremont style, has come to be identified by the leading edge of the left as white, as white American, civic nationalism
Right.
is white civic nationalism.
Sure.
And so that's sort of the broader context for this. So I just wanted to clarify for people also that that's the meta background and our critique of the 64 Civil Rights Act for those not familiar with it. And it started with, as you pointed out, Jeremy, not with Chris Caldwell's book. It predates his book, of course, with libertarian jurisprudes like Richard Epstein long before Chris. But Chris had this book that was journalistic in style and wonderfully written and evocative and sprinkled with these wonderful anecdotal examples from cultural history, ranging from sports figures getting canceled for saying bad things back in the 90s to the transformation of advertising throughout the decades following the 60s and into the 70s to voting patterns to all the rest. I mean, Chris is a skilled rhetorician and book writer. That's why his book had such an impact. But his critique was, look, the people who signed up for the 64 Civil Rights Act, that is the white majority in America, thought it was addressing a discrete problem, which was Jim Crow in the South and the legacy of Jim Crow, both at the time and then its lingering effects. But what we quickly got was something else, which was a kind of racial millet system, or call it what you will, which was quickly planted in law and administrative behavior, where the oppressed and the oppressors are given out different honors, privileges, and advantages on hiring exams or in the affirmative action case, admission to colleges, and then take your pick on down the line. And that's been more and more instantiated in human resources departments and how Fortune 500 and 100 companies conduct themselves after the 90s revision of the Civil Rights Act. So anyway, just wanted to provide all that background. Probably very familiar to most of our listeners, but I don't know. My ramble is not really a question, but I don't know if you had any.
Well, no, I mean, Ryan, I think you're absolutely right, and I think Chris does do a great job of talking about that, and also talking about the things that got layered on top of the 64 Act, and then even cases like Griggs versus Duke Power, which I've written a lot about, the 1971 Supreme Court case that gave us disparate impact doctrine, which basically says, I'm oversimplifying, but basically if you have a hiring process that is not intended to be racially discriminatory, but you kind of wind up with a non-proportional kind of group outcome, that you've got to do all these things to justify why you did that, or you're presumptively assumed to have violated the law. If you go back and read the actual text of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and particularly the congressional debate around that, it's really clear that they were pretty much explicitly saying nothing like disparate impact is going to happen, and then it just happened anyway. So I think that's one really important piece of it. And, I think it's just kind of been a remarkable accretion. My one strategic point, and again, I think it's a slightly different spin than Chris and some others, which is that I understand kind of the intellectual appeal of really kind of going over the Civil Rights Act's shortcomings. I think when I'm talking about this in the popular mind, I don't focus as much on that, because to me it's water under the bridge. I mean, it needs to be addressed in the current cycle. But what I simply say is, look, we are as distant. I mean, that was a very blunt instrument to deal with. And Ryan, you just touched on this, a very discrete set of problems that everybody agreed were problems, particularly in terms of anti-Black discrimination that were going on. And, I'm not going to kind of like relitigate that per se, except to say we're as distant from that as they were from the Wright brothers. A lot of in time. a lot of things have happened since then, and it's time for whatever good and bad it did, and you can kind of weigh that and have that interesting intellectual discussion. Now it's time to kind of revisit this because the problems it solved are really not there anymore, but it's created a whole host of new problems.
I wanted to ask one of these classic, you wrote a book, so you have to ask this questions, which is, what was the most surprising thing you discovered in your research for the book?
That's a great question, Ryan, and you've put me on the back foot, as the British say.
And on the spot. Sorry, Jeremy.
Yeah, no, I'm not. I'm sort of struggling. Like what? Well, I mean, there's an anecdote that I think is interesting, but I want to see if I can come up with something a little bit more systemic. I'm not immediately coming to it, so I'll maybe come back to it. But so I'll just tell the anecdote because I think the anecdote is very revealing of a lot of other things that are really in the news. Which is, I was familiar with the Bakke case. The Bakke case was the central case that was just overturned by the Supreme Court. That was the original case that outlawed, or rather, I'm sorry, it made affirmative action the law of the land in university admissions. It was a very kind of messy case. I won't try to summarize the jurisprudence because I'm not an attorney, and you had 6 different Supreme Court opinions and a 9-justice court. But the kind of interesting thing is the story that's sort of told about that is, well, Bakke, who is this white student and he had superior qualifications, he didn't get in, and then he sues, and there's a long process. And actually, eventually, for various reasons, he is admitted. But
and it was to the one clarification. It was to was it UC Davis's medical school?
UC Davis Medical School, right? So the interesting little tidbit that I did not know, it's more than a tidbit. There's an African American student who's kind of seen as the stand-in for the guy who got in because Bakke didn't. And this guy is the subject of 10-page, encomia in the New York Times talking about how wonderful he is, and Ted Kennedy giving a speech in Congress about how wonderful he is. And he's like a mini celebrity. And because he's like working in the inner city and doing all this stuff, and, the bad white doctor would have never done that. Kind of turns out he ultimately ends up killing a couple of his patients. He loses his medical license because of various abuses that he has. And eventually he is shot and killed by the side of a road in a crime that is never solved. And I don't want to get in any legal trouble here, so I won't say that it was a former patient, but there is some implication around the circumstances of it that it may have been a former patient who was very displeased with his or her treatment that might have been involved in some way in that. And so this guy who's often cited as this is the epitome of affirmative action. I mean, literally, I think Ted Kennedy or the New York Times says this, and I recount this all in my book, but it turned out to kind of be more appropriate in the exact opposite way of which it was meant. And so kind of learning beyond just the skeleton of the Bakke case as I went into it was sort of a particularly memorable thing.
Yeah. And also for legal reasons, I'll, as the one fiduciary of the Institute here on this podcast, I'll say when you say he killed a couple of his patients, not murder, death, kill, as they say.
Yes. Just
through negligence. Yeah.
Medical negligence.
You can't libel the dead.
Okay, well.
Okay. Thank you, Seth.
I don't think there's any libel there. Anyway, it's an interesting story. I tell it in the book. Some of the early readers kind of came up to me. The reason I thought of it and said, wow, I didn't know that whole story about Bakke. That's pretty incredible.
And he was working, am I misremembering, Jeremy, or he was working at some Oakland medical facility it wasn't named after him, but it was sort of.
It was in Los Angeles, actually.
Oh, LA, okay.
In LA County. Yeah. And meanwhile, Bakke went off to the Mayo Clinic. And I don't know what his career ended up completely being, but I'm sure if he'd done anything bad, we would have had 1,000 New York Times page articles about it. So he turned out to be a competent doctor at a very good hospital. So
no, that's amazing, Jeremy. And I don't think that's trivial or marginal at all. I think it's kind of emblematic or like representative of how these major cases get totally mythologized, and the left is so good at doing this that you turn somebody into an untouchable icon,
right.
Footnote George Floyd, right? I mean, even that, and the fact that that's kind of true back to Bakke is amazing.
Yeah, no. All these things, I don't know. I'm sure you guys have had similar experiences. I find whenever I really dig deeply into a historical item of almost any kind, I'm like, oh man, the left lied about that as well, and they basically got away with it. That's just kind of the universal experience almost. I feel like
we need like a lies my teacher told me.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Sure.
I agree. I think this is the occasion for a Claremont volume. So back in the 90s, I'm reviewing a bunch of our old strategic documents for our planning going forward the next 5 years. So we have this 98 document, and one of our projects at the time was a truth and history program. So I think that needs to be revived.
And can I make a request that we include like
Please.
a sins of omission dimension to this? Because
Yeah.
a lot of this has to do with stuff that I feel it's like the emphasis and the things that we're just not paid attention to in school, even the degree to which we concentrated on the Holocaust to the total exclusion of Stalinist Russia and the Gulag. Like there's just a lot of that kind of stuff that would be worth going into.
I raised this question on one of the group chats that everyone's a part of these days. Just before we started recording. Yeah. Do we have any theories on when the sort of year zero of progressive historico-politico ideological gaslighting started in sort of post-war America?
Well, Yarvin would probably say like 17.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that's why it's like
16,
a little
20.
bit. That's why ultimately all that analysis, by the way, from Yarvin, as much as I do enjoy reading it, can be a little bit because it's like it's all failed, it's all fake, and yet here we are. We've had 250 or more years of a lot of people who lived and died in a very prosperous America, due in of course in a Claremont view to the wisdom of our founding fathers, and then aided by folks like Lincoln. And so, if that's failure, I'd love to see success. And maybe
I completely agree, Jeremy. And I think it does sort of play up by a reductio ad absurdum, the futility and pointlessness of locating the where did we go wrong date, which, in less extreme versions than Yarvin's is just endemic. It's everywhere on the right? It's like it was 1964, it was the Protestant Reformation, it was this or that. And it's like, of course you can always do that, but you're always fighting off death, staving off whatever.
It was the 95 Theses, right? I mean, it's like...
My favorite anecdote about this is from one of our fellowship faculty who will remain unnamed to protect his innocence or his reputation, but who teaches at a college and everyone would know. And he's a Claremonster, so he argues the case for the American Revolution and the founders' virtues on founding a constitutional small R republic. And then he gets rebuttals from many types, traditionalists and all the sorts. And they say, no, we needed the small community of republicanism or quasi-republicanism where, faith and the gods were properly respected and the community was close enough that everything worked. And it has to be from this student's perspective, or this universe of students' perspective, of course, post ancient world and post Christian revolution internationally. And that the professor in question would always say, well, okay, what society are you talking about here? Like, give me a specific example. He said usually they fade out after that. They don't give one. But at one point he got 16th century Iceland, in this little historical period, which was, so it always stuck with me because it's evocative and hilarious and absurd at the same time.
Yeah. And I think, kind of to turn that a little bit back to my book, what I tried to do in the book is not to just be too abstract and kind of say, oh, there was this golden age and we're not in it, or we can't be in a golden age because we didn't keep the Articles of Confederation or something, dumb like that. But to really just kind of it's a very concrete, just the facts, ma'am, type approach to this. And it's really similarly, the solutions are very much in the real world. It's not kind of like Jeremy's list of fantasy things that he'd like, but are not going to come true. It's like, okay, we've got a problem. We want to have a harmonious multi-ethnic democracy, and that's not going to go away that we have a multi-ethnic society. So how do we deal with this in a very practical sense? Using prudential statesmanship, again, kind of the hallmark of Claremont, right? Because I don't think that there's not a kind of theoretical abstraction that gets us to perfection here. It's prudence.
Yeah. It was actually a leitmotif is maybe too fancy a word, or even not quite right, to bring up the Yarvin-Ruffo debate. Yarvin he was kind of asking, Ruffo was kind of asking Curtis not for a silver bullet, but actually to like, what's the plan, man? And Curtis kept just falling back on what Curtis does quite well, which is to bring up obscure texts that and historical facts that might complicate our current narrative. We should just say a brief shout out to Rufo, Chris Rufo. If anyone has not, so this will drop on the 18th of April, overnight on the 16th of April. If you go look at Chris Rufo's Twitter feed, he scheduled overnight, which he broadcast publicly. So I'm not revealing trade secrets, but just a series of highlighting of the head of NPR's, what's her name? Kristen Marr, I think.
Marr, yeah.
Yeah. Of just her, he's dredged up her tweets over the last 10 years or so. And it's quite entertaining. Chris sort of running with one of the things he does best, which is public dissemination of the absurdities and contradictions of the modern left.
And I've got to say,
and its silliness. Yeah.
And at first I loved it, and I was like liking every tweet and commenting. And at some point I was just like, mercy.
Stop. Like, he's already dead. He's already dead.
Like my brain couldn't take any more of the absurdity. And just, Chris was like turning it. I literally tweeted, it's like performance art, what he was literally doing. I mean, it transcended mere tweets. So I thought it was stuff.
Oh, I couldn't get enough, Jeremy. I could go for 2 weeks. I'd be fine with it. Okay, well, that's great. Thank you, Jeremy, for writing the book. Thanks for all you do. And let's get on to our second topic, which is, I think only one of us has seen this movie, but I might be wrong. That is Spencer.
I'm bursting with excitement.
I know. We might just have to wrap the podcast and not even get to the third segment, I suspect. But this new movie out, which we talked about the trailer of it months ago, Civil War. So it's a movie that I'll sketch it quickly if Spencer wants to fill in some details, that would be helpful. But it's the latest movie from the writer director who did Ex Machina. Remind me, is it Garland? Is that right, Spencer?
Alex Garland. Yeah,
Alex Garland. Thank you. Who's a talented guy in the world of film, has made interesting movies. I was a big fan of Ex Machina. He has this movie Civil War, which is set in America where the Western forces, or whatever they're called, Texas has allied with California to oppose a Nick Offerman-headed autocratic regime based in D.C. That's sort of the setting, and it follows some journalists as they try to drive across parts of America to go interview the president, where they've been told that journalists are shot on sight in the nation's capital. We lamented the tone and implications of the trailer back when it dropped, which seemed to us to be not doing any good for lowering the temperature of our national political conversation, and seemed to have some implications that were one-sided, to say the least. We wanted to highlight this. The Slate has this interesting podcast called Cultural Gabfest, and they took up the issue of the movie, and they're articulate, intelligent folks, all on the left. And they, part of the critique that I wanted to hone in on of the movie was they were like, it's beautifully done. It's a great suspense movie, classic, wonderful filmmaking. But it's vapid in the following sense. How can it be just a one side, both sides is a movie on our current cultural question? I mean, it's obvious to all of us, this is them talking, that that this is not a bipartisan problem. There's only an obsession with political violence and a wink, wink, nod, nod calling for violence on one side of our political spectrum. That is the right. Look, we don't want it to be vapid, to paraphrase one of the participants explicitly. We didn't want it to be vapid and say Trump is bad and they're all fascists and MAGA is bad, et cetera. We all know that's the case. We don't need to be told that in a pedantic way. But the movie left a couple of them cold in its thematic treatment of what's tearing the country apart, as much as they admired the cinematography and the pacing and the writing of it. So I thought we could just dig into it a bit, because it's one more data point in the old Scott Adams description of American politics that he surfaced, I think, in 2015 or 2016, which is that it's a good heuristic for how America operates and argues these days, is we're just watching two different movies.
Okay, I can't believe we get to talk about all of these things in one segment. I'm a little overstimulated, so I'm going to try to contain myself to just a few comments. First of all, I will confess to you, my brothers and sisters out there listening, that the Slate Culture Gabfest, besides our podcast, is my favorite podcast. I listen to this show every week. I'm not proud of it. I'm very ashamed, but in the interest of full disclosure, I just have to say that this is not my first time listening to these guys. And for the reasons that you say, Ryan, they're, the left in general, I think, is very good at culture and cultural commentary. I think we can all broadly sort of agree with that. And so this is one of the most interesting, just like chit chat shows about something I'm really fascinated with, which is pop culture and its sort of political valence. Obviously disagree with, like, down to the ground everything they ever say about politics. And on this movie, also about their interpretation of the film, because it shows how blinkered they are, that they think this is a both sides movie where anybody could look at it and just interpret it one way or another. There's no universe in which you can picture Nick Offerman as anybody other than a Trump or post-Trump figure in this movie. And that speaks to the fact that, like, I don't know, I was super disappointed in this film. I agree with you, Ryan. I like Alex Garland generally, or find him kind of hit or miss. Ex Machina is really good. He made this movie called Men, which just sounded dreadful. I didn't see it. And then this movie, the smartest thing about it was the trailer. The trailer was a work of brilliance because it revealed just enough for everybody to get really angry and share it on Twitter and speculate about what it was like. We took the bait in, I think, a totally valid way and discussed it here on this podcast. But it turns out, Ryan, that what you just said and what was revealed in the trailer is the full extent of the plot of the movie. Like, that's all that he gives us. And he doesn't actually have anything else to say about a real and serious topic, which is the fact that there are kind of rumblings of ways that things could really go south in America. And instead, like, in place of that, Alex Garland has made a movie about journalism. This is the movie that is playing in Keith Olbermann's head 100% of the time. It's like these guys that imagine themselves as the valiant hero of a war-torn America because Trump won in 2016. This is the literal version of that movie. And it's kind of comical once you realize that that's what's going on. But the whole thing is taken up with, like, journalism school level moral quandaries about, should we photograph this or that atrocity? Like, what does it mean to give the president airtime? And the grand conceit of it all, and then I will stop because I could go on about this forever. It's just so delicious and hilarious to me. But the grand conceit is that, like, the deep introspective moral problem of Kirsten Dunst's character and all of these valiant reporters who, by the way, all for some reason work for Reuters and the New York Times, as if those are the people that are really getting the cutting edge journalism today and putting themselves in harm's way. But, like, their biggest internal struggle is, like, how can we be neutral at a time like this? But it's like, you're not neutral. You haven't been neutral for like a decade, and this movie isn't neutral. So the whole thing is this elaborate kind of self-flattering conceit on Garland's part and on the part of, I'm sure, the people he's playing to, which is the press. I just think it's like, it's almost, I wish I would have enjoyed more a serious and careful far left description of,
right,
the evils of Trumpist America. Like, that would have been more interesting than this movie. But alas,
yeah, and that's what we were teased with in the trailer in many ways. So it's let down all sides in a way, and I guess that the sort of normal take on it is that's a virtue, but I think instead I agree with you, Spencer. Having not seen it, I will venture the opinion that it's leading us by the nose on down a certain path, but it's cloaked in this bipartisan dissolution narrative.
Yeah, well,
there's a moment.
I'm going to see it with my oldest son this weekend, and I never see movies, but he's like, "Oh, do you want to go watch this?" I'm like, "Actually, I kind of do now, Spencer. You sort of ruined it for me a little bit." But
sorry.
Part of the reason I want to see it, kind of shamelessly tying it back to my book, but in this case, very genuinely, is I'm actually writing an op-ed on my book titled "What Kind of American Are You?" which was kind of the money line from that trailer. because I think we're the kind of guy, for those of you who've not seen the trailer, he's sort of these people are very scared and they say we're Americans, and then the guy with the gun says yes, but what kind of American are you? And people kind of really fixated on that. But I think very much in this identity circus that we in Claremont lament but have to deal with, and again, my book's kind of about how should we deal with this question of what kind of American are you, I think is very central to the debates we're having. And so I was hoping it would at least interrogate that in a somewhat interesting way, but it may have just done so for the purposes of a really good 3-minute trailer.
Okay, the Jesse Plemons cameo, Jeremy, I start not to ruin it for you further. I actually think you'll probably enjoy it, and mercifully it's very short, which is one of its few virtues, I think.
Yeah, bless you, Garland, for not making another 2-hour and 40-minute movie. Yeah,
amen. I just think I liked Killers of the Flower Moon, but I think it should be a crime to make a movie that's 3 hours long, unless it's literally Lawrence of Arabia. Anyway,
or Gone with the Wind,
or The
Godfather. Well, so. Actually, a lot of great movies are really long.
3-hour movies are great.
In fact, you should exclusively award Oscars to 3-hour movies. The Plemons cameo and the Offerman turns out to be a cameo also. He has a much smaller role than the trailer suggests. Not only is that one of the most disappointing parts of the movie, but it's also one of the key tells, because those two guys, the casting alone, those guys have come to stand in for evil Appalachian buck-toothed white man,
right,
which is basically who they are in this movie. There are some very funny lines, though, in that one scene. So I think it's one of the high points of the movie, if only because of Plemons.
It's funny, I guess it goes back to all the president's men, like Watergate, and this whole trope of journalists as fit for being the star, or having a movie about them as the hero.
Right.
But I don't know, this idea that they're kind of crusaders and that it's so funny because, for one thing, Woodward and Bernstein to begin with were complete establishment, figures, hacks, probably a plant. But now, certainly, what are we thinking? Maggie Haberman is some kind of superhero. These people are utterly of the system, completely obvious, manifestly biased. That's their role. So
and Seth, the movie is written as if nothing has happened since Watergate. It really comes directly out of that playbook, right down to the fact that, I think I say this in my review, the closest we've actually come in this country to widespread civil conflict is unquestionably the great arson spree and looting fest of 2020, during which the only people actually putting themselves in harm's way to get revelatory footage of what was going on were these rando streamers, these independent Twitch journalists who had to dodge their way through these scenes of carnage while CNN stood out there with a chyron saying fiery but mostly peaceful. That figure, I can't even believe I'm saying this, because I wouldn't believe it if I hadn't seen the movie. That character is nowhere in this movie. There is not a single even allusion to the fact that anybody other than Reuters does journalism. And that to me is astonishing.
Yeah, another entry in this category, which this discussion reminded me of, was the 2015 film Spotlight about the Washington Post's role in revealing the Catholic priests, pedophilia scandal with Mark Ruffalo, Michael Keaton, Rachel McAdams, Liev Schreiber, and others. So,
oh my gosh! But I remember, she said,
yeah,
don't forget, she said the Me Too version, which is kind of beyond.
That one, I'm excluding films that didn't do any commercial success.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough.
But that's a few interesting points raised on that Cultural Gabfest podcast on Slate is that the Garland film it's tracking to be very commercially successful. So no doubt partly the product of that very effective trailer, as you discussed, Spencer.
But also because it says to people who go, the kinds of people that often go to artsy movies like the ones that A24, the studio, makes, it says to exactly those people everything that they want to hear about themselves and about the world they live in. So,
right.
Of course, it's going to do great.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a film tailor-made to launch well on Wednesday at midnight in LA and New York. Yeah.
The Nashville theater I went to was crowded. I was surprised.
Yeah.
I thought there was going to be nobody there, but yeah.
Yeah. I just have one anecdote about films and premieres, etc. I maybe I've brought this up before, but it's been like at least a year or two or three since I have. But I was interested that so the Spielberg Lincoln movie I saw at a pre-release in LA with a normal sort of Hollywood crowd, and it garnered an ovation at the end. And then I saw it in Jacksonville, Florida, like a week later, with probably a much more diverse crowd given the demographics of Jacksonville versus Hollywood, or at least for moviegoers. And it also elicited not a standing ovation, but an ovation. And, Jacksonville it's like the southern edge of the deep South. If no one's been to Jacksonville, it's right at the top end of Florida. It's more spiritually Georgian in some ways than, say, Orlando or definitely Miami, of course. So I just thought that was interesting. We don't need to comment on it, but it stuck with me. Well, let's close out with a quick discussion. Seth just wanted to say a few things. Maybe we can riff on it just a bit. We're getting close to the end. The Google employees, or a certain segment of them, had a sit-in recently at headquarters. I think maybe a couple days ago. Maybe it might have been yesterday. It doesn't matter. A group of them, they created this TikTok video to go along with it, or Instagram video, maybe pulled from TikTok. Sorry, Zoomers, I'm failing you as an elder millennial to properly document the origin.
So you're giving them everything they want by offering a boomer figure. Or
just call me a boomer, and it's okay.
Yeah.
And a portion Google is involved in some aspect of Israel's technological military infrastructure. So they wanted to oppose this newest project or set of initiatives by Google, or commercial relationships, which amounted to, as they called it, the endorsement of genocide, or the facilitation of genocide. So they all sat in, and I believe a number of them got arrested because Google is not Columbia, and the work has to go on.
Yeah, well, I just think it's so funny, this idea that it's like campus everywhere. Like, if you watch the video, they all seem to be like in their early 20s, as they call themselves Googlers. Weirdly infantile sense of righteousness. It's very similar to the way like college students talk. Like, well, I can't really get in trouble, so I'll do whatever I want. Because ultimately, I'm paying $80,000 a year to go here. Which to some extent, it's true. They do get away with a lot. Like, sometimes they get suspended for their antics on campus. But these Google people, it just cracks me up so hard to watch these videos where they're like, okay, we are going to occupy the CEO's office until he agrees to do whatever we say, including like talking about how it's a health and safety violation for Arab, Muslim, and Palestinian Googlers to have to like work on this topic, or work on this project. I mean, I don't have an enormous amount to say about it, but I'm just kind of fascinated. There's this weird sense of like rectitude and a complete, total like misunderstanding of what their role is. Like, that they're not tuition paying students. They don't have the right to, like, you can't sit in somewhere. You can't, you're not going to have the dean come and address your grievances and pretend that you're kind of part of the university. And yes, okay, well, we have to, yes, we respect your free speech and sitting in my office, so taking over this, I mean, the CEO's office at like a multi-trillion-dollar company, and you expect like anyone's going to pay attention to you. I mean, it's like a couple dozen people, whatever. It just seemed like, for some reason, I was just cracking up. And then naturally they all got arrested, and I guess they'll get fired. So, God bless them. But
if Inez Stepman were here, she would probably say something about campus life becoming real life, and how the riots of the 1960s will become the riots of the 2024 or whatever. But that is really, maybe in 10 or 20 years, we'll get the equivalent of Alan Bloom from Google, whoever that is, writing like the closing of Silicon Valley's mind or something. That would be very funny.
Yeah, it would be a day more, right? He needs to get a Straussian PhD and then write the book on it.
Yeah, I actually think it's more interesting and deeper. I mean, I agree with everything you just said, Seth, but than that, and I've conspicuously avoided wading in deeply to Israel-Palestine for a variety of reasons. But I have to say, as much as I try to be even-handed, I mean, all these Palestine protesters just are like the worst excesses of the left in every respect. And, you sort of look at what they do. I actually think what I come back to is not as much the Google Office thing, and I think they might actually be fired, although they might not. The bridge where they shut down this week, the Golden Gate Bridge in both directions. And they knew, this is the deep thing to me, that they could go on that bridge and shut it down for 5 hours with impunity, and they won't be punished, right? I think it says something very deep and meaningful about how much this alleged protest is really just a tool of the regime in some, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So I think that's like the very key, non-trivial, sort of scary thing to me is, right, like they know that they can disrupt the lives of everybody, and that they will not pay any serious consequence for it. And I think it says something really deeply disturbing in a sort of Chinese Cultural Revolution Red Guard way about the kind of leading edge of leftism in America today.
Totally. And the crazy thing is, civil disobedience, they wrap themselves in the mantle of civil disobedience. But the whole point of and they claim that civil disobedience is First Amendment protected activity. Yeah. But the whole point of civil disobedience is that it's against the law. Right. Like, it's not First Amendment protected. Like, blocking traffic sitting on a bridge by definition is against the law. But they think, well, because I'm protesting,
right,
it raises my activity into this higher sphere where everything I do is allowed to happen. Listen, I don't want to go on about this, but this woman who runs Within Our Lifetime Palestine, like some group here in New York, she got arrested yesterday for blocking traffic. And Laura Loomer was like, oh, well, I guess you got your bail paid by Soros. And she's like, what are you talking about? I don't get my bail paid by Soros. There was no bail.
Right.
It was just a violation. So you're exactly right. There's no, this is because there's no prosecution, no consequences. That proves that their activity is state sanctioned, and it's effectively like a tool of the regime, as you said.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we need to conclude our podcast, but first, what we skipped last week, and that was my fault for avid listeners, was the Read the Damn Site section, where we recommend something to read from the American Mind. So I will start off picking at random with Spencer Clavin. What have you been reading in American Mind?
Oh, I was like, do I have a piece on the site? I thought you. No. I had parsed your sentence slightly differently and thought you said we were going to start off with. Okay,
it's a eat, shoot, sleeves problem,
right? Exactly. Commas are important, kids. I will pick a piece called Through-a-Scope Backwards by
you took mine.
Hey, I always do my best to anticipate somebody. Pull the rug out from underneath. So Will Thibault, he's the director of our center, or rather American Military Project at the Center for the American Way of Life, which is the Claremont Institute's sort of DC branch. He's doing really important work there that is not just writing, that involves, that policy and serious thought about action. But this piece is just so fun. I really like when somebody takes sort of a minor, obscure internet kerfuffle and elicits from it the larger significance. I mean, sort of like, Jeremy, when you were talking about the Bakke case and what you found out in your research, I just think it's actually really illuminating to use a very particular profile or issue to kind of raise these things. And so this is about a publicity photo that the Navy put out of a sailor shooting a rifle but the scope is backwards and it looks like it's closed, which in itself is simply hilarious.
Not only a sailor, but a somewhat senior officer. Yeah.
Like the commander of the boat.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, true. So, right, the whole, that's sort of to Will's point, actually, that, he says the Navy chose to brag about the fact that a commanding officer of a destroyer is leading his ship by shooting his poorly configured rifle on full automatic, looking through backward and closed scope in a manner that would produce no effect on an intended target. Saying this is not just a fluke or an accident or the sort of thing that could happen to any of us. Sort of like when the plagiarism stuff was coming out about Claudine Gay and all these folks tried to be like, oh, well, who among us hasn't plagiarized a paragraph here or there? And that's kind of the attempt that they're making. But actually, this is in some ways an emblem, like a glittering image of deeper dysfunction in the military. And it's a great piece. It's called Through Scope Backwards by Will Thibault.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Spencer. Seth?
Yes, I really liked a piece that we posted Wednesday evening by our friend TJ Harker, who's a former federal prosecutor, and he's looking at the case in Manhattan right now, Alvin Bragg's case against Trump. And TJ gets into this whole question of, well, what is fraud? And how do you pursue a criminal investigation of fraud? And so it's kind of like he gets into some legal theory and prosecutorial questions, but I think a lot of us are familiar with the idea that this is kind of trumped up, but TJ really, brings the receipts, as they say, and explains exactly why this whole thing is a complete sham. And, he focuses on this great point, which I just think is so fascinating, that it's not like people demand money in order to keep silent. And this happens all the time. It's just called a settlement. And he makes this point. He's like, this has become known as the hush money case, which is weird since it is not unlawful to pay hush money, but it is unlawful to demand it. It's called extortion. So why isn't Stormy Daniels on trial for blackmailing Trump? All he did was respond to the blackmail. So it's a crazy case. It's a great piece. TJ's done a lot of work on all of these prosecutions and sort of explaining in depth why they're so twisted and, abusive. So I really recommend that everybody read that piece.
Thanks, Seth. I'll go next in case Jeremy wants to dredge something up. But Jeremy, you don't have to do it. We sprung this on you. So, and Spencer stole your piece. I'm actually going to color outside the lines a bit myself and just recommend for everyone actually a piece not on the American Mind, but we would have published it in a heartbeat, and it's by one of our people. Theo Wold worked in the Trump administration on domestic policy and briefly at the Justice Department, worked on immigration, on the wall, and a lot of other stuff. He's the former Solicitor General of Idaho, which a post he took up for briefly in recent years, and is our new director of the Administrative State Project, which really is just our plan for the first 100 days of a new administration. Not just that, but you just put it in that context because it's kind of the window of action, especially for a lame duck president, which Trump will be pretty quickly if he wins, being it's his second term. The question is what to do about the deep state and the administrative state, which are one encompasses a bit of the other, but they're somewhat distinct. The piece is at the American Conservative, a friendly organization. Many of the editors there, both junior and senior, are former Claremont Fellows, Helen Andrews, Bradley Devlin, maybe one or two others. The piece is called Schedule F Won't Tame the Deep State. But it's bigger than just a commentary on Schedule F. Theo takes up the interesting question of, a kind of not a potted, but a quick cook's tour of the history of the growth of the administrative state, the protection for civil servants, and really the doing a little bit of good work, which actually a lot more work needs to be done, about how the spoils system was really not a huge portion of the federal administrative apparatus under the president's control, really a small part, and how the spoils system was really not as bad as it was or has been pitched as. It's another instance of progressive history being written as if, before the Pendleton Act, which was passed in the late 19th century after the assassination of Was it Garfield? I think it was
Garfield.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeremy. Before that, it was just the Wild West, and there was a complete turnover in every presidential administration, all the way down to postmasters, root and branch. But that was never really the case. It was supposed to be a remedy for a very discrete problem, which was if you have this basically 10% of the presidential appointee class who control money at ports of entry and customs and all that sort of thing, you don't want them to just be cronies from a political machine for obvious reasons of corruption, temptation, and the rest. So a very limited thing that happened in the late 19th century with civil service reform has now blossomed with I will just point out a couple of key court cases in the 20s and 30s into the jurisprudential basis for our modern administrative state, which insulates so much of the federal rulemaking apparatus in the bureaucracies from any real presidential control. A remedy in the Trump administration at the tail end was this thing called Schedule F, which took 40 or 50,000 of these bureaucrats who exercised discretionary policy control, and subjected them to removal by executive order or by regulatory reform. Anyway, Theo is skeptical of that as he calls it, a magic button. Much more will be needed, and it's something we're working on, among other things. So I'm happy to end it. But Jeremy, did you have any piece you wanted to bring up?
Well, since Spencer stole my will piece, I will shamelessly plug my own piece.
Excellent.
Expropriation, the Endgame of Anti-Whiteness, which is a modified and shortened version of the penultimate chapter of my book. And it gets into what I refer to some of the more speculative kind of attempts to kind of answer, well, what is the motivation of all this anti-whiteness? As I sort of say in the book, it doesn't, so you'll appreciate, Spencer, here I'm about to make a rare classical allusion. It does not spring fully armored like Athena from Zeus's head. There's reasons, there's gestation, etc., going on here. So it sort of looks at why, and it looks at it in the context of essentially saying, look, this is ultimately about resources, and white people tend to have them and other groups want them. And so I look at reparations a lot, and not just in kind of terms of the kind of black-white reparations that have been getting some attention, but looking at other groups, sort of stuff that is on the horizon that may not really be even people who are kind of paying attention may not be aware of some of the things that are going on the periphery, that if we open up this reparations Pandora's box, you're going to be seeing a lot more of it. And I even talk about reparations that are not called reparations, but that's functionally what they are. And I sort of give a kind of a grand theory of why we're seeing some of the things that we're seeing. So, folks can feel free to check that out. And if it looks interesting to them, they are welcome and encouraged to buy the book and spread the word.
Excellent. Great way to end. Well, thank you all for joining us this week. If you want to learn more about all that the Claremont Institute does, visit our various websites. The main one being www.claremont.org, americanmind.org, claremontreviewbooks.com, or all of our work on policy on these issues that we hold dear: identity politics, constitutionalism, civic nationalism, and immigration. A few discrete subjects that we want to weigh in on and advise and teach legislators and staff on at dc.claremont.org. We do a bunch of national work, but also work around the states, Florida, Texas, and others. And thank you, as always, to the engineering crew, Jake Gannon and Logan Zeppieri. And please, if you like this, please rate us 5 stars only. Help spread the word. We appreciate it. And thank you all for listening. We'll talk to you next week.